Hi, and welcome to Bookable Space, the audio literary salon. Author of Remembered, I'm your host, Yvonne Battle-Felton. I'm a writer, host, presenter, academic, and a reader. I love being read to. In each podcast episode, a writer will read to us and answer 3 questions. We might talk about how they developed the characters, the sense of place, why they wrote the book, something they learned through research, and more. Ultimately, through each episode, I hope to get to know each author a little more, and I hope that you do too. Each episode is about 30 minutes. You'll find the author's bio and a bit about the book below the episode. Thanks for joining in. Today we're joined by Tim Wendel. Tim will be reading from and talking about Escape from Castro's Cuba. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm so looking forward to reading and talking to you. And I have to say, you know, here talking to you today, I really missed the sound of your voice.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I feel like you have this really calming presence. And it works really well to just like remind you to slow down and just, you know, take it easy and breathe. So thank you so much for being a calming presence today. And we're going to be talking to you, and you're going to be reading from Escape from Castro's Cuba. So should we just dive right in?
Let's do it. That sounds fun.
Wonderful. So what was it like for you diving back into Billy, Fidel Castro, and the other characters into that setting in the world that you created?
It was, Yvonne, first of all, it's great to be with you. Great to see you again. But it was more difficult than I thought it was going to be a little bit. And I should have listened more to my agent or whatever, because it technically, Escape is a sequel to my first novel, Castro's Curveball, and I've done some other things in between, obviously. And I thought I was done with Cuba. Then I took my wife to Cuba in 2017, and this is my 4th trip. And it was mind-boggling how different it was, almost from the get-go. We got off the flight. We flew Southwest Airlines from Baltimore. That was crazy. And landed. And this guy, we're coming across the tarmac. They weren't able to pull a gate up or something. So we're walking across the tarmac toward customs. And this guy saddles in next to me. And I could tell he's Cuban. And I'm thinking, plainclothesman? Who is this cat? And I hadn't been there in 6-7 years. And he says, call me Ricky. And I went, okay, Ricky, hi. But I didn't say my name. And we're still approaching customs. And then we're about ready to reach customs. And he goes, what brings you back to Cuba again, Senior Wendel? And I'm thinking, oh my God, I got my wife with me and they know I'm back here already. And we found out later I had arranged an off the record conversation at the U.S. interest section. So they must have had a mole there who contacted, the plainclothesman or whatever. So that was the start of a crazy trip. And I thought I knew everything about Cuba. So I came back home and I'm going, all right, got read about Cuba again. I'm jazzed up. And okay, writing about Castro again. I'll even read a little bit of section from that. That was okay. And I missed some of the characters, but both novels have a first person narrator, Billy Bryan, who is kind of this washed up baseball player. He's not an ugly American, but he's somewhat, he's carrying a lot of burdens, shall we say. And obviously this is the guy, if I'm going to do continue the story, it makes sense. I need the voice. I need the guy who did it. And it was funny because Billy wouldn't talk to me for a little while. He was like a little ticked off, like when you don't call your mother for several weeks or something, like, where you been? It's been years since you reached out to me. What's been your problem? And it's funny because for fiction and nonfiction, but for fiction, I'll interview my characters like out loud. It's a great way to be left alone. And finally, Billy started to talk to me again. And once he did, it took off and away we went. So, but that was the biggest problem at first. Is Billy going to talk to me? And in fact, I even remember telling my wife, saying, oh, this is going nowhere. Billy won't talk to me. And she's like looking at me like I'm crazy. But once he did, we were rolling.
Oh, that's amazing. Did your agent ever say why they thought that you shouldn't like return to the book or to Billy?
No, I was kind of between agents and such, and one did, because Curveball did pretty well. I mean, it's been optioned to the movie several times, but I don't know. Who knows where agents are coming from half the time. I think everything's like a knee-jerk reaction on what's going on that day. And I think if you read a little bit too much into it, and bless my heart, I've got great representation. I love them all. But I've kind of learned maybe not to take everything they say as gospel.
Which is good, because at least you did it. Like, you followed what you wanted to do and you wrote the book, and it's really interesting and engaging. So, there's to following your passion and your ideas.
Yeah. I mean, what's that old thing? I mean, somebody told me years ago, I mean, you got your mind, heart, gut, so to speak, and gut's intuition, really. And when the three line up, you got to go. You got to do it. And if something's a little bit out of alignment, it's almost like getting static on the radio or something. But coming back from Cuba, those three were in alignment. I was ready to roll. And then once Billy started to talk to me, we were in good shape.
Oh, that's wonderful. So speaking of Billy, can we have our first reading, please?
Oh, yes, I'd love to. And this, I had an old teacher of mine one time, Nick Del Banco at Michigan. He said, if in doubt, start at the beginning. So let's start at the beginning. This is the voice of Billy. Let's see. The assistant cameraman held out the slate detailing the next scene, and once again the clapperboard snapped down. And action, the director said. With the cameras now rolling, I told myself to stay calm, hold my gaze. Thankfully, I only had a few lines today. All I had to do was sit in the ancient stadium in Havana as the Panavision cameras moved in from either side and pretend to be my old friend Papa Joe Hanrahan, who was once the chief scout for the Washington Senators. In doing so, I tried to ignore the fact that I had somehow found myself back in Cuba, a star-crossed land that always seems to get the best of me. It's a beautiful game when it's played well, isn't it? Said the guy sitting next to me in the box seats behind home plate. I waited, softly inhaling for a long beat, as I had been coached to do, before nodding in agreement. It's more than a game here, I replied, trying to speak my lines slowly and with a measure of conviction. It will always be a way of life. Of course, the real Papa Joe Hanrahan died decades ago, and I'd been recast as him for this movie. Davy Buccalo, who played my boss in the picture visiting from Washington, seemingly hung on my every word as the cameras continued to zoom in on us, eavesdropping on our conversation in the crowd at the ballpark. That it is, my friend, Buccalo agreed. Back in America, baseball represents the 4th of July. Mom's apple pie, but here they've been playing the grand old game almost as long as we have, for it's always been the game of an independent Cuba. I nodded again as he waxed on about the game here in Cuba, its rich pageantry, the flair with which they play, all the crap they were laying on thick for this big budget Hollywood feature, so much so that I couldn't help thinking the Cuban government had a hand in it all. Out on the diamond, players from the Havana Lions, dressed in flannel uniforms from the late 1950s, took infield practice. I had to admit that this was a fitting backdrop for our snapshot history lesson of baseball in Cuba. We had rehearsed the scene several times, and the process had fallen into that comfortable place of being familiar, yet not quite predictable. Over Buccalo's shoulder, I noticed that a new kid had moved onto the field, taking over at shortstop. He fielded the ball effortlessly, flipping down his weathered glove at the last possible moment, and then firing the ball onto first base in a single fluid movement. While he appeared to be hardly putting any effort on the ball, it flew on a line toward the first baseman. Even though I was supposed to be hanging on every word from Buccalo, I stole another glance toward first base as another delivery arrived, courtesy of this kid at shortstop. My old teammate Chuck Cochran, who had been cast to type as an ornery coach, had his eyes on the new kid too. Then everything around me grew quiet. I realized that Buccalo, who had put so much effort into his lines, had stopped speaking and was looking at me. Everyone, him, the director, the people on either side of us, seemingly the cameras themselves, were waiting for my reply. The only problem was that I had forgotten my lines. I had forgotten what to say next.
Wow. It's funny because like listening to you read it, it brings it to life, and there's like this other layer to it. And I don't even watch baseball, but but I feel like I want to go to a game and have you doing like the commentary of it. And I feel like I'll be like, yeah, now I see it. Now I can see this because like I've gone a whole lifetime and only gone to one baseball game
Oh,
and
we got to
not
do a
like
game sometime.
I can't even say I've missed it. And it probably wasn't even the full game. It was the one Orioles game where the lights went out and they had to reschedule the game because like whoever they were
Oh
going against
my,
was pitching too
that's a
fast
very
or something.
famous game. That was the one with Cal Ripken and everything. There's a podcast called The Rumor you should check out. Supposedly they turned off the lights on purpose to keep the
Wow.
streak going for Ripken, because Ripken had gone back home after forgetting something. God, this is crazy. This is like street vibe in Baltimore. And he had gone back home and found his wife in bed with another man.
No.
Yeah, there's a whole podcast, 6 parts, called The Rumor, which kind of teases that out. But
Wow.
so you were there at a very epic game. I was at that same game, by the way.
Were you?
I was in the press box and we're trying to figure out what the heck is going on here.
They cracked me up when they were like, you can, like, I guess they gave replacement tickets or something. You could go a different night. And I was like, no, thank you. Yeah, I just couldn't do it. Felt like I had done enough to go through the first.
Oh, but baseball's always what's next. That's the fun thing. So it's a little bit.
I don't know. Only when you read it. Like I feel like when I'm there watching it, I'm going, oh, what's next? But like when I'm hearing you read it, I'm going, oh, what's next? So that was going to be my question. What is it about baseball that lends itself to a good thriller? Now, I could see what would lend it to a good murder, but but what is it about it that lends it to like a really good thriller? What does it allow you to say or show or suggest? And I guess I'm also curious how it allows you to reach readers who might not ordinarily either engage with books or with baseball.
Right. Well, baseball goes slower, and you would think that's bad. But on the other hand, we're slowing down, we're getting deeper into something. And one reason I like writing about baseball, fiction or nonfiction, I've done it for several years now, is from a literary standpoint, from a writing standpoint, it often breaks down the one-on-ones. So it's the pitcher versus the batter. It may be even the fielder trying to catch the ball. It could be, even the environment, the fans, how much abuse they're giving one individual, maybe even the weather. So I love, because if you think about other sports, like if you're going to write about, I don't know, somebody runs around right end in football and goes all the way for the touchdown. Okay, that's great. That's fun. But there's a lot of moving pieces. Somebody had to block somebody a certain way. He had to do, a certain move. Now the quarterback even had to call the right play, blah, blah, blah. So it can really get, I don't know, teased out in the wrong way pretty quickly. Whereas with baseball, you can always spin it back to, the one-on-ones. It's funny. I'm thinking of Yvonne. I don't want to go too deep in it. Years ago, I was in Hollywood. I went to a Dodger game with a director who knew nothing about baseball. And I'm talking with him and actually we were trying to get some interest in curveball back in the day. And about the 3rd inning, he suddenly goes, I got it. I go, well, what do you got? Because what I'm explaining right here isn't very, very good. And he said, you look out there and that guy with the ball who's getting ready to throw it. I go, that's the pitcher. Yeah, the pitcher. He's kind of on this area. It's kind of cockeyed, but it's like he's on a stage and he starts everything. He's kind of like the everyman in a Shakespeare play or something. And he gets everything in motion and it's going to start or stop with him. And he gave this beautiful definition of, I went, that's great. You got it.
I think maybe if I give baseball another try, what I might try to do is look at it narratively and see, and like, because that could just be that connection because otherwise I'm going, wow, it's still the same inning. And
it goes on forever.
It doesn't. I feel like that's the one sport you definitely get your money's worth. Like when you go
You
to
like it or not.
yeah, exactly. Like who would have thought? But I think maybe if I look at the because I think it is possible to look at and say, well, so which character would I be most interested in? And maybe
Sure,
it's not the
sure.
pitcher, maybe it's the person who, I don't know, doing whatever else anybody else does in baseball.
It's
But like
not a
one of
fielder or a
those.
catcher. You just focus on them. It's funny
Yeah.
what you're bringing up. I took, it wasn't that long ago. I took my mom to her first baseball game. And my mom came from Michigan, so she knew football, she knew hockey, she knew all these things. And she kind of came into it with the same mindset. I mean, she was kind of intense, and she's like, just watching. And finally, about, again, second or third inning, she kind of turns to me, and we're with a bunch of people that we knew. And she goes, okay, similar to the guy at Dodger Stadium. She goes, I get this now. And I go, what do you get, Mom? And she goes, well, we're just going to hang out here, have something to eat, have a couple beers and talk. And when something really exciting happens, we'll cheer about it. But we'll just kind of go with the flow. And I'm going, you got it. That's what it is. We're just sitting around here talking. And it's a great game. Just to, if you've got a friend you haven't caught up, want to get caught up on their life, take them to a baseball game. You got a lot of time just to catch up.
Oh, see, that's what I needed to know. That social part of it. Okay. Now I can do it.
You'll have a fun time.
And
no matter what happens on the field. You got a little ways to wait.
Exactly. I don't even have to take myself up on it. I could just be like, maybe theoretically, hypothetically, baseball. But with that in mind, can we have another reading, please?
Yes, love to. So one of the characters in this is a guy named Fidel Castro. So we might as well do something that brings him in. In the first novel, he's only 22 or something. He's much more aged in this. So let's have some fun here. The knock came at the hotel door, as I knew it would. I opened it to find a soldier telling me a car was waiting out front. We went downstairs and I went into an SUV, and as soon as the door closed and the SUV sped away, and soon we were accelerating through toward the sweeping seawall of the Malecon, the breakwater that is in Cuba. Along the sidewalk facing the sea, more kids had gathered this evening to sing, along with a cheap guitar, or gazed out upon the water and what might lie just out of sight. How I wanted to be with them rather than heading toward this rendezvous with my past. We slowed only briefly at the signal near the base of Old Havana, and soon broke free of the traffic, making good time in the left lane of the boulevard that hugged the rim of the famous Deepwater Harbor, the place where the Spanish conquistadors brought their loads of treasure stolen from the hinterlands of the New World. On the far side of these dark waters, the searchlight atop Morro Castle, where so many were executed in the months after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, still sprayed its light across the ancient city. A hard turn took us away from the harbor. We sped past the old railway station. It was followed by a quick left and then a right and then another. We could have been a boxer putting in time on a speed bag. Jabs and swings, cuts and misses. Soon I wasn't sure exactly where we were, only that we were far away from Old Havana, the famous hotels, Chinatown, the ballpark, all the parts of town that I really knew. 20 minutes later, we pulled up in front of a low-slung villa where most of the lights were off and figures moved among the lush vegetation that sheltered the walkway leading to the front door. My car door opened and I followed another soldier away from the street and farther into the shadows. In front of me, the door swung wide and I went inside. The far wall sported 3 flat-screen televisions with all the games from that night from the West Coast. The Giants, Dodgers, Twins, Angels, Red Sox, Diamondbacks. I loved seeing this Mike Trout play, a voice from the darkness said. He could almost be Cuban, don't you think? I took another step into the room, letting my eyes adjust. Dressed in a black silk robe with dark slippers, Fidel Castro sat on a leather couch with the remote control in his hand. Billy, please come join me. I reached out my left hand to make sure I could navigate myself to a place on the far end of the couch. A drink, Bill? Still in Manhattan? Fruit muddled? I had to smile. Even though it had been years and years, Castro had done his homework. He wanted me to think he actually remembered my favorite elixir. I haven't had one of those in a long time, I replied. Then perhaps it's time for another, Castro replied. Castro nodded to the bartender who made up one of those devils. The guy then refilled Castro's glass of doors with water and disappeared back into the shadows. Which game do you wish to watch? Castro asked.
Wow. There's such tension, even in them coming together.
Very much. Castro's very much a lion in winter in this book, and he's just as dangerous as he was in the first.
Is there an audiobook as well?
Yes, and actually I did the audiobook.
I was going to ask, did you do?
Yes, I'm doing more audiobooks now, which is a real treat. It's even though it's a trip, it's kind of bizarre.
But I'm not at all surprised that they would have you like do it, because there's just something that it just comes to life, and it's the characters, it's the silences, the pause, that tension. It's just captivating. So I'm not at all surprised that they would be like, you know what? Yeah, you're the voice for these books.
It's funny. I got into audio. It had to be with Cancer Crossings, the memoir I did about the cancer docs and my brother with leukemia and such. And they sold the rights. I forgot where they sold the rights. And at the 11th hour, I said, I'd like to do it. And everybody went, oh God, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. And, but I did an audition and I realized now I was on a very short leash in the studio. I think I've messed it up too much. They just said, okay, you're out of here. But it was funny. We did it 3 nights, 75 pages a night. I was whooped. And, but then they said in a couple of weeks, you'll be coming back for pickups. I had no idea what they were talking about. And so in a couple of weeks I come back and I'm still going, what are we doing here? What's this about? And finally they're getting set up and I went in, the little isolation booth where I'm back there again. And I start flipping through the pages and I see highlighted a lot of the medical terms and drugs, methotrexate, Cytoxin, donomycin. I'd mispronounced them. I made sure I'd spelled them right, obviously in the text, but I was saying them in all different ways. So sometimes now I even wake up in the middle of the night and say Cytoxin, donomycin.
So I get to ask my final question, which you would have thought that was it, but it's not. So what sort of research goes into writing for you? Like what does that research look like? And what's one interesting thing that you found out that did not make it into either this one or the first one?
I like going, and it's been a little difficult with COVID, but if I can go to the place, Havana, or, say I'm working on another book right now, it's set in Niagara Falls. I'm feeling if I can go to the place, even though it's been maybe years since whatever time frame I'm writing about, I think it opens up the doors. I can hear the ghosts a little bit better. They're there. Okay. What do they really believe? And, what happened with I had a smidgen of this in Curveball, the first one. And I was thinking all along I'll have more of this in the sequel, and it just didn't quite fit. And so maybe at some point I've got to do a third one. But what I'm talking about is Santeria, and kind of all those ceremonies are so big in Cuba. And I've actually been snuck into the Clone Cemetery, which is the huge cemetery in Havana at night for one of these. And I haven't quite put it in a book yet. That's driving me crazy. And I had kind of forgotten about it a little bit. And of course I'm there with my wife, who's, great writer, great reporter. And she's seen at one point we were in some part of Havana way off the beaten track from the tourists. And all of a sudden here's these women, with like kind of white headdresses, long flowing white gowns, and they're walking down the street, and every now and then they would just stop, like I don't want to say been shot, but something, some kind of nervous reaction, and they would drop to their knees. And we figured out later they didn't know half these people. They suddenly would take a bystander's foot, take off the shoe, and start bathing the feet. And, it's part of their whole thing. But the ceremony I was at in Cologne Cemetery, we had, I don't know, parts of chickens and all this stuff. And I'm going, okay, this is interesting. But it was all, again, trying to talk to the ghosts, talk to the people that have passed on. And they have these ceremonies over like the grave sites and everything. So at some point I got to find a place for that. I will.
It strikes me that it seems like that's something we're all trying to do in one way or the other, like talking to ghosts, whether it's through fiction or nonfiction or poetry or religion. And I love that you were snuck into it and that's not what you wrote about. Do you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't like, I saw this thing and let me reveal how they did it. Do you know?
Yeah, but I didn't want to get, it's not like I'm super good friends with those people that got me in, but I didn't want to get them in trouble. So, maybe that's why I backpedaled on it at first. But I'll tell you, being in Cologne Cemetery as the clock approaches midnight is kind of eerie.
I feel like being in any cemetery as the clock.
That's true. And I get scared pretty easily, but I kind of hung out there going, okay, what are we doing?
Wow. I love that. So with that in mind, could we have one final reading, please?
Oh yeah, I'd love to. Let's, I need to set this up just a smidge. We're late at night here too. We're not in a cemetery, but we're, in a car, a BMW, outside. We're in Monterrey, Mexico, and there's three people in the car. One's Billy, the narrator, Chuck, who's been alluded to a little bit in the past, his friend from his old baseball days, and a woman named Yvonne, who is one of Billy's two daughters, actually the one from Cuba. And we'll pick it up there, and they're waiting. It's late at night. They're trying to see if the prospect they saw, the baseball prospect in that very first scene, is going to defect. Please stay put, Yvonne, Chuck added. Here, we'll try this. And he eased the car a little further up the alley, poking the BMW's nose out so we could see all the way down the street in either direction. Nothing was going on. A doorman paced back and forth, and the neon light reflected off the windows of the storefronts across the way. Reminds me of the old days in Havana, Chuck said, when it got too late for anybody's good. What was that like? Yvonne asked him, the anger fading from her voice from her earlier argument. Havana? Chuck asked. Yes, back in those old days. Chuck turned the car off and glanced at me with a wry smile. In those days, Havana at night was the most beautiful place in the world, Chuck said. Of course, it was corrupt and dangerous, but you can't have everything, right? Everyone loves to harp on that now, and for God's sake, we knew it back then too. It was such a sight to behold, such a beautiful land when everyone came out to play. Why was that? Yvonne asked. What made it so special? Different strokes for different folks, Yvonne, Chuck replied. Billy and your mother used to love to go down to the harbor and watch the cars roll off the night ferry from Key West. I found myself nodding. Me, I like to listen to Lola, Chuck continued. She was my girl, or was supposed to be, or should have been. Anyway, she sang at the Hotel Riviera. For her last song of the night, she nearly always belted out Somewhere Over the Rainbow. By then, it was well into the wee hours of the night, like it is now. The crowd had thinned out. Sometimes hardly anybody was left if it was the middle of the week. But she sang that song because she knew I liked it. And I always stuck around for the end of that last set. What happened to Lola? I couldn't help asking. You know, Billy, I don't rightly know. Last I heard, she was somewhere in Los Angeles doing bit parts and pictures. It's how too many things play out, right? You think you have all the time in the world, that you'll stay in touch with the precious ones in your life forever, but it doesn't pan out that way, now does it? You lose track. With each passing year, it becomes too difficult to find them, downright embarrassing to reach out, and by then, what's the point anyway? Yvonne said, you could still call her. I don't know, darling, Chuck said. That's your generation talking. With guys like your father and me, it ain't so easy. Even though we do it so much in our heads all the time. I mean, I can close my eyes and just like that, Chuck said as he snapped his fingers, I'm back to those late nights in Havana at the Riviera. Even at that hour, Lola often had some well-wishers and I'd stay out of the way. I mean, what's a hick ball player bring to the table in those kinds of situations, right? And afterward, I knew she liked to change, freshen up, so I'd wait by the backstage door, sitting there on the steps, probably smoking another Cuban stogie. Somehow, from that small alleyway, I could see all the way down to the water and the lights atop the Hotel Nacional. And that's where we often ended up. There was always time for a nightcap in Havana, right, Billy? Even if we were playing a doubleheader the next day. Always time for a nightcap, I agreed. And you know what I remember the most, Chuck said? It's the smell of the sea. Even well off the Malecon breakwater, farther inland, even near the old Colón Cemetery, you always knew you were close to the ocean in Havana, no matter how much it was built up. I mean, heap upon heap of mafia money and neon glow and big band music and foolish laughter. So many people carrying on. Through it all, the sea was always out there. It always seemed like it was only a few blocks away. I believe that's what made the town feel so full of ghosts. The sea breeze was always coming off the Florida Straits, holding everything's heart. We grew silent inside the BMW, staring out upon that empty street in Monterrey, Mexico, as the night gathered around us. Everything Chuck had said was as true as anything can be. Closing my eyes, I was back there, walking along the Malecon in Havana at dusk. Once again, Melina Fonseca was on my arm as we gazed upon that dark expanse of water. How far? Melina would ask. It was a question she loved to ask, even though she knew the answer as well as I did. 90 miles from Havana to the Florida Keys, I'd say. Only 90 miles, she would repeat, as if it was the most important number in the whole world. And to think we're almost there. Then she would smile, a sight I'll never forget. Papa, Yvonne said, somebody's out front.
Tim, thank you so much for such engaged readings. Thank you for your generosity in answering all the questions. Where can we find Escape from Castro's Cuba?
Well, you can obviously order it online. It came out with Nebraska Press, so that's one place to look. It is on Amazon and such, but if I had to champion any independent bookstore, and I realize I'm talking to somebody in the UK, but one of my favorite bookstores is just outside of Washington, D.C. It's called One More Page, and we actually did the book launch for this book, several others there, and so if it's something you'd like to do, reach out to One More Page, and they've got copies.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for being my guest and for sharing this time with me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Yvonne. Great to be back with you.
Thanks for listening to Bookable Space. If you don't already have the book and want to read more, buy it, borrow it from your local library, read it, and if you enjoy it, review it if you haven't already. I hope you'll join us for the next episode of Bookable Space, the audio literary salon with your host, Yvonne Battle-Felton. Follow me on Twitter at @Battle-Felton, on Instagram on @IWriteBattle-Felton for pictures, interview insights, and more.